Homage to Catalonia. Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest thou be like unto him. Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own conceit. Proverbs. Chapter 1. In the Lenin barracks in Barcelona, the day before I joined the militia, I saw an Italian militiaman standing in front of the officer's table. He was a tough-looking youth of 25 or 6 with reddish-yellow hair and powerful shoulders. His picket leather cap was pulled fiercely over one eye. He was standing in profile to me, his chin on his breast, gazing with a puzzled frown at a map which one of the officers had opened on the table. Something in his face deeply moved me. It was the face of a man who would commit murder and throw away his life for a friend. The kind of face you would expect in an anarchist, though as likely as not he was a communist. There were both candor and ferocity in it, also pathetic reverence that illiterate people have for their supposed superiors. Obviously, he could not make head or tails of the map. Obviously, he regarded map reading as a stupendous intellectual feat. I hardly know why, but I have seldom seen any man, to whom I have taken such an immediate liking. While they were talking round the table, some remarks brought it out that I was a foreigner. The Italian raised his head and said quickly, "Italiano?" I answered in my bad Spanish, "No, inglés. ¿Y tú?" "Italiano." As we went out, he stepped across the room and gripped my hand very hard. Queer, the affection you can feel for a stranger. It was as though his spirit and mine had momentarily succeeded in bridging the gulf of language and tradition and meeting in utter intimacy. I hoped he liked me as well as I liked him, but I also knew that to retain my first impression of him I must not see him again, and needless to say, I never did see him again. One was always making contacts of that kind in Spain. I mention this Italian militiaman because he was stuck vividly in my memory. With his shabby uniform and fierce, pathetic face, he typifies for me the special atmosphere of that time. He is bound up with all my memories of that period of the war, the red flags in Barcelona, the gaunt trains full of shabby soldiers creeping to the front, the grey, war-stricken towns further up the line, the muddy, ice-cold trenches in the mountains. This was in late December 1936, less than 7 months ago as I write, and yet it is a period that has already receded into enormous distance. Later events have obliterated it much more completely than they have obliterated 1935 or 1905 for that matter. I had come to Spain with some notions of writing newspaper articles, but I have joined the militia almost immediately because, at that time, and in that atmosphere, it seemed the only conceivable thing to do. The anarchists were still in virtual control of Catalonia, and the revolution was still in full swing. To anyone that had been there since the beginning, it probably seems even in December or January that the revolutionary period was ending. But when one came straight from England, the aspect of Barcelona was something startling and overwhelming. It was the first time that I had ever been in a town where the working class was in the saddle. Practically every building of any size had been seized by the workers and was draped with red flags or with the red and black flag of the anarchists. Every wall was scrawled with the hammer and sickle and with the initials of the revolutionary parties. Almost every church had been gutted and its images burnt. Churches here and there were being systematically demolished by gangs of workmen. Every shop and cafe had an inscription saying it has been collectivized, even the bootblacks that have been collectivized and their boxes painted red and black. Waiters and shop walkers looked you in the face and treated you as an equal. Servile and even ceremonial forms of speech had temporarily disappeared. Nobody said "señor" or "don" or even "usted". Everyone called everyone else "comrade" and "thou" and said "salud" instead of "buenos días". Almost my first experience was receiving a lecture from a hotel manager for trying to tip a lift boy. There were no private motor cars. They had all been commanded, and all the trams and taxis and much of the other transport were painted red and black. The revolutionary posters were everywhere, flaming from the walls in clean reds and blues that made the few remaining advertisements look like daubs of mud. Down the Ramblas, the wide central artery of the town where crowds of people streamed constantly to and fro, the loudspeakers were bellowing revolutionary songs all day and far into the night. And it was the aspect of the crowds that was the queerest thing of all. In outward appearance, it was a town in which the wealthy classes had practically ceased to exist. Except for a small number of women and foreign girls, there were no well-dressed people at all. Practically everyone wore rough working-class clothes, or blue overalls, or some variant of the militia uniform. All this was queer and moving. There was much in it that I did not understand. In some ways I did not even like it, but I recognized it immediately as a state of affairs worth fighting for. Also, I believed that things were as they appeared, that this was really a workers' state, and that the entire bourgeoisie had either fled, been killed, or voluntarily come over to the workers' side. I did not realize the great number of well-to-do bourgeois were simply laying low and disguising themselves as proletarians for the time being. Together with all this there was something of the evil atmosphere of war. The town had a gaunt, untidy look. Roads and buildings were in a poor repair. The streets at night were dimly lit for fear of aid raids. The shops were mostly shabby and half empty. Meat was scarce and milk practically unobtainable. There was a shortage of coal, sugar, and petrol, and a really serious shortage of bread. Even at this period, the bread queues were often hundreds of yards long. Yet so far as one could judge, the people were contented and hopeful. There was no unemployment, and the price of living was still extremely low. Saw very few conspicuously destitute people, and no beggars, except the gypsies. Above all, there was a belief in the revolution and the future, a feeling of having suddenly emerged into an era of equality and freedom. Human beings were trying to behave as human beings and not as cogs in the capitalist machine. In the barbers' shops where anarchists noticed, the barbers were mostly anarchists, solemnly explaining that barbers were no longer slaves. In the streets were colored posters appealing to prostitutes to stop being prostitutes. To anyone from the hard-boiled, sneering civilization of the English-speaking races, there was something rather pathetic in the literalness with which these idealistic Spaniards took the hackneyed phrases of revolution. At the time, revolutionary ballads of the naivest kind, all about proletarians' brotherhood and the wickedness of Mussolini, were being sold on the street for a few centimes each. I had often seen an illiterate militiaman buy one of these ballads, laboriously spell out the words, and then, when he got the hang of it, begin singing it to an appropriate tune. All this time I was at the Lenin barracks, ostensibly in training for the front. When I joined the militia, I had been told that I should be sent to the front the next day, but in fact I had to wait while a fresh centuria was got ready. The workers' militia, hurriedly raised by the trade unions at the beginning of the war, had not been yet organized on an ordinary army basis. The units of commands were the section of about 30 men, the centuria of about 100 men, and the column, which in practice meant any large number of men. The Lenin barracks was a block of splendid stone buildings with a riding school and enormous covered courtyards. It had been a cavalry barracks and had been captured during the July fighting. My centuria slept in one of the stables, under the stone mangers where the names of the cavalry chargers were still inscribed. All the horses had been seized and sent to the front, but the whole place still smelled of horse peas and rotten oats. I was at the barracks about a week. Chiefly I remember the horsey smells, the quavering bull calls. All our buglers were amateurs. I first learned the Spanish bugle calls by listening to them outside the fascist lines. The tramp of hob-nailed boots in the barrack yards, the long morning parades in the wintry sunshine, the wild games of football 50-a-side in the gravelled riding school. There were perhaps 1,000 men at the barracks, and a score or so of women, apart from the militiamen's wives who did the cooking. There were still women serving in the militias, though not very many. In the early battles they had fought side by side with the men as a matter of course. It is a thing that seemed natural in time of revolution. Ideas were changing already, however. The militia man had to be kept out of the riding school while the women were drilling there, because they laughed at the women and put them off. A few months early no one would have seen anything comic in a woman handling a gun. The whole barracks was in the state of filth and chaos to which the militia reduced everything building that they occupied, and which seems to be one of the byproducts of revolution. In every corner you came upon piles of smashed furniture, broken saddles, brass cavalry helmets, empty sabre scabbards, and decaying food. There was frightful wastage of food, especially bread. From my barrack room alone, a basketful of bread was thrown away at every meal, a disgraceful thing when the civilian population was short of it. We ate at long trestle tables out of permanently greasy tin pannikins, and drank out of a dreadful thing called a porron. A porron is a sort of glass bottle with a pointed spout from which a thin jet of wine spurts out whenever you tip it up. You can thus drink from a distance without touching it with your lips, and it can be passed from hand to hand. I went on strike and demanded a drinking cup as soon as I saw a porron in use. To my eye, the things were altogether too like bed bottles, especially when they were filled with white wine. By degrees, they were issuing the recruiting with uniforms, and because this was Spain, everything was issued piecemeal, so that it was never quite certain who had received what, and various of the things we most needed, such as belts and cartridge boxes, were not issued till the last moment, when the train was actually waiting to take us to the front. I have spoken to the militia uniform, which probably give us a wrong impression. It was not exactly a uniform, perhaps a multiform would be the proper name of it. Everyone's clothes followed the same general plan, but they were never quite the same in any two cases. Practically everyone in the army wore corduroy knee breeches, but there the uniformity ended. Some wore puttees, other corduroy gaiters, other leather leggings or high boots. Everyone wore a zipper jacket, but some of the jackets were of leather, other of wool, and of every conceivable color. The kinds of cap were about as numerous as their wearers. It was usual to adorn the front of your cap with a party badge, and in addition, nearly every man wore a red or red and black handkerchief round his throat. A militia column at that time was an extraordinary looking rabble, but the clothes had to be issued at this or that factory rushed them out, and they were not bad clothes considering the circumstances. The shirts and socks were wretched cotton things, however, quite useless against cold. I hate to think of what the militia men must have gone through in the early months before anything was organized. I remember coming upon a newspaper of only about 2 months earlier, in which one of the poem's leaders, after a visit to the front, said that he would try to see to it that every militiaman had a blanket, a phrase to make you shudder if you have ever slept in a trench. On my second day at the barracks there began what was comically called instruction. At the beginning there were frightful scenes of chaos. The recruits were mostly boys of 16 or 17 from the back streets of Barcelona, full of full of revolutionary ardor but completely ignorant on the meaning of war. It was impossible even to get them to stand in line. Discipline did not exist. If a man disliked an order, he would step out of the ranks and argue fiercely with the officer. The lieutenant who instructed us was a stout, fresh-faced, pleasant young man who had previously been a regular army officer, and still looked like one, with his smart carriage and spick-and-span uniform. Curiously enough, he was a sincere and ardent socialist. Even more than the men themselves, he insisted upon complete social equality between all ranks. I remember his pained surprise when an ignorant recruit addressed him as "Señor." "What? Señor? Who is that calling me Señor? Are we not all comrades?" I doubt whether it made his jobs any easier. Meanwhile, the raw recruits were getting no military training that could be of the slightest use to them. I had been told that foreigners were not obligated to attend instructions. The Spaniards, I noticed, had a pathetic belief that all foreigners were more of military matters and knew more of military matters than themselves. But naturally, I turned out with the others. I was very anxious to learn how to use a machine gun. It was a weapon I had never had a chance to handle. To my dismay, I found that we were taught nothing about the use of weapons. The so-called instruction was simply a parade ground drill of the most antiquated, stupid kind. Right turn, left turn, about to turn, marching, at attention, in columns of 3, and all the rest of that useless nonsense which I had learned when I was 15 years old. It was an extraordinary form for the training of a guerrilla army to take. Obviously, if you have only a few days in which to train a soldier, you must teach him the things he will most need: how to take cover, how to advance across open ground, how to mount guards and build a parapet. Above all, how to use his weapons. Yet this mob of eager children who were going to be thrown in the front line in a few days' time were not even taught how to fire a rifle or pull the pin out of a bomb. At the time, I did not grasp that this was because there was no weapons to be had. In the poem Militia, the shortage of rifles was so desperate that fresh troops reaching the front always had to take the rifles from the troops they relieved in the line. In the wall of the Lenin barracks there were, I believe, no rifles except those used by the sentries. After a few days, though still a complete rabble by any ordinary standard, we were considered fit to be seen in public, and in the morning we were marched out to the public gardens on the hill beyond the Plaza de España. This was the common drill ground of all the party militias, beside the carabineros and the first contingent of the new formed Popular Army. Up in the public gardens it was a strange and heartening sight. Down every path and alleyway, amid the formal flower beds, squads and companies of men marched stiffly to and fro, throwing out their chests and trying desperately to look like soldiers. All of them were unarmed and none completely in uniform, though on most of them the militia uniform was breaking out in patches here and there. The procedure was always very much the same. For the 3 hours we strutted to and fro. The Spanish marching step is very short and rapid. Then we halted, broke the ranks, and flocked thirstily to a little grocer's shop, which was halfway down the hill and was doing a roaring trade in cheap wine. Everyone was very friendly to me. As an Englishman, I was something of a curiosity, and the carabinero officers made much of me and stood me drinks. Meanwhile, whenever I could get our lieutenant into a corner, I was clamoring to be instructed in the use of a machine gun. I used to drag my Hugo's dictionary out of my pocket and start on him in my villainous Spanish. Yo sé manejar fusil, no sé manejar ametralladora. Quiero aprender ametralladora. ¿Cuándo vamos a aprender ametralladora? The answer was always a harassed smile and a promise that there should be machine guns instructions mañana. Needless to say, mañana never came. Several days passed and the recruits learned to march in steps and spring to attention almost smartly, but if they knew which end of a rifle the bullet came out of, that was all they knew. One day an armed carabinero strolled up to us when we were halting and allowed us to examine his rifle. It turned out that in the whole of my section no one except myself even knew how to load the rifle, much less how to take aim. All this time I was having the usual struggles with the Spanish language. Apart from myself, there was only one Englishman at the barracks, and nobody even among the officers spoke a word of French. Things were not made easier for me by the fact that when my companions spoke to one another, they generally spoke in Catalan. The only way I could get along was to carry everywhere a small dictionary which I whipped out of my pocket in moments of crisis. But I would sooner be a foreigner in Spanish than in most countries. How easy it is to make friends in Spain. Within a day or two there was a score of militiamen who called me by my Christian name, showed me the ropes and overwhelmed me with hospitality. I am not writing a book of propaganda, and I do not want to idealize the poem Militia. The whole militia system had serious faults, and the men themselves were a mixed lot, for by this time voluntary recruitment was falling off, and many of the best men were already at the front or dead. There was always among us a certain percentage who were completely useless. Boys of 15 were being brought up for enlistment by their parents, quite openly for the sake of the 10 pesetas a day, which was the militia man's wage. Also for the sake of the bread which the militia received in plenty and could smuggle home to their parents. But I defy anyone to be thrown as I was among the Spanish working class. I ought perhaps to say the Catalan working class, for apart from a few Aragonese and Andalusians, I mixed only with Catalans, and not be struck by their essential decency, above all their straightforwardness and generosity. A Spaniard's generosity, in the ordinary sense of the word, is at times almost embarrassing. If you ask him for a cigarette, he will force the whole packet upon you, and beyond this there is generosity in a deeper sense, a real largeness of spirit, which I have met him again and again in the most promising circumstances. Some of the journalists and other foreigners who traveled in Spain during the war have declared that in secret the Spaniards were bitterly jealous of foreign aid. All I can say is that I never observed anything of the kind. I remember that a few days before I left the barracks, a group of men returned on leave from the front. They were talking excitedly about their experience, and were full of enthusiasm for some French troops who had been next to them at Huesca. The French were very brave, they said, adding enthusiastically, "Más valientes que nosotros," braver than we are. Of course, I demurred, whereupon they explained that the French knew more of the arts of war, were more experts with bombs, machine guns, and so forth. Yet the remark was significant. An Englishman would cut his hand off sooner than saying a thing like that. Every foreigner who served in the militia spent his first spent his first few weeks in learning to love the Spaniards and in being exasperated by certain of their characteristics. In the front line, my own exasperation sometimes reached the pitch of fury. The Spaniards are good at many things, but not at making war. All foreigners alike are appalled by their inefficiency, above all their maddening unpunctuality. The one Spanish word that no foreigner can avoid learning is mañana, tomorrow, literally the morning. Whenever it is conceivable possible, the business of today is put off until mañana. That is so notorious that This is so notorious that even the Spaniards themselves make jokes about it. In Spain, nothing from a meal to a battle ever happens at the appointed time. As a general rule, things happen too late, but just occasionally, just so that you shan't even be able to depend on their happening late, they happen too early. A train which is due to leave at 8 will normally leave at any time between 9 and 10, but perhaps once a week, thanks to some private whim of the engine driver, it leaves at 7:30. This is still happening today. Such things can be a little trying. In theory, I rather admire the Spaniards for not sharing our northern time neurosis, but unfortunately I share it myself. After endless rumors, mañanas, and delays, we were suddenly ordered to the front at 2 hours' notice, when much of our equipment was still unusual. There were terrible tumults in the quartermaster's store. In the end, numbers of men had to leave without their full equipment. The barracks had promptly filled with women who seemed to have sprung up from the ground and were helping their menfolk to roll their blankets and pack their kit bags. It was rather humiliating that I had to be shown how to put on my new leather cartridge boxes by a Spanish girl, the wife of Williams, the other English militiaman. She was a gentle, dark-eyed, intensely feminine creature who looked as though her life work was to rock a cradle, but who, as a matter of fact, had fought bravely in the street battles of July. At this time she was carrying a baby, which was born just 10 months after the outbreak of war and had perhaps been begotten behind a barricade. The train was due to leave at 8 and it was about 10 past 8 when the harassed, sweating officers managed to marshal us in the barracks square. I remember very vividly the torchlight scene, the uproar and excitement, the red flags flapping in the torchlight, the massed ranks of militiamen with their knapsacks on their backs and the rolled blankets worn bandolier-wise across the shoulders, and the shouting and the clatter of boots and tin pannikins, and then a tremendous and finally successful hissing for silence. And then some political commissar standing beneath a huge rolling red banner and making us a speech in Catalan. Finally, they march us to the station, taking the longest route, 3 or 4 miles, so as to show us the whole town. In the Ramblas, they halted us while a borrowed band played some revolutionary tune or other. Once again, the conquering hero stuff, shouting and enthusiasm, red flags and red and black flags everywhere, friendly crowds thronging the pavement to have a look at us, women waving from the windows. How natural it all seems then, how remote and improbable now. The train was packed so tight with the men that there was barely room even on the floor, let alone on the seats. At the last moment, William's wife came rushing down the platform and gave us a bottle of wine and a foot of that bright red sausage with taste of soap and give us that gives you diarrhea. The train crawled out of Catalonia, and on the plateau of Aragon at the normal wartime speed of something under 20 kilometers an hour. So, chapter 2.